The last 70 years of Toravan scholarship had failed to answer the simplest question in galactic history, and historian Dresk Vahel intended to answer it before his second heart gave out. The question sat in the margin of every major atlas published since the Compact's founding. Why did the Orion exclusion exist? Not the administrative explanation. Every cadet in every naval academy could recite the formal designation, could point to the red hatching on their charts and say, Restricted Sovereignty Autonomous Designation 4, Human Territorial Claim. That was not the question. The question was why the galaxy's 312 spacefaring civilizations, commanding a combined fleet tonnage that could glass a main sequence star, had collectively agreed never to cross a line drawn by a species that had not been seen in open space for over a century. Why the charts simply stopped. Why the margin note read in old Compact trade script, do not survey, do not traverse, do not contact. Dresk Vahel had spent 40 years building the definitive academic history of the exclusion, and he had come to the conclusion that the written record was lying to him. Not lying through fabrication that would have been detectable, traceable, the kind of institutional dishonesty that left seams. The record was lying through absence. The gaps were too clean. The missing files too uniformly distributed across every archive he visited. The transferred clerks too consistently unavailable for follow-up. When a record was hollowed out, when the truth was not replaced but simply removed, leaving behind a shell of administrative language with nothing inside, that was a lie maintained by consensus. And consensus, in Dresk's experience, required fear. Dresk was 63 years old by Toravan reckoning, which made him old enough to have seen the exclusion discussed in 3 different ways across his career. In his youth, it had been presented as an anomaly, a curiosity of interstellar politics. In his middle years, it had become a controversy, a subject that senior academics discouraged, that funding bodies declined to support. Now in his late career, it had become a silence. Not a prohibition. No one had ever formally told Dresk to stop researching the exclusion, but the silence around the topic had thickened, year by year, until it had the density of a wall. Journals that had once published his papers returned them with regrets and no explanation. The gap had grown around the topic itself, not just around the records. He had begun his research voyage 104 days ago, departing Toravan Prime aboard a chartered survey shuttle with academic transit credentials and a Bureau of Cultural Sciences authorization that was, technically, sufficient to access any unrestricted archive in the Compact. The unrestricted qualifier was the joke. Every archive along the exclusion boundary maintained an unrestricted collection that contained supply manifests and maintenance logs, and a restricted collection that contained everything else. The restricted collections were not formally classified, they were simply inaccessible, locked behind administrative protocols that could not be appealed because they had never been formally enacted. His first stop had been the Heliomar Naval Archives, the largest military records facility in the Compact. He had arrived with a formal request to review deployment records for patrol vessels assigned to the exclusion boundary between standard years 1814 and 1856, a 42-year period that encompassed the initial establishment of the boundary. The archivist on duty, a young Heliomar named Touche, had processed the request with the efficiency of someone who did not yet understand what they were handling. Within 4 hours, Dresk had been given access to a reading terminal and a curated selection of documents that told him almost nothing. The deployment records existed, they were complete. Every vessel, every patrol route, every fuel expenditure, every personnel manifest, all accounted for. But the operational logs for the patrol vessels themselves were absent, not classified, not restricted, absent. The field where the operational log should have been linked read, File not found, archival migration error, every single one. 473 patrol vessels over 42 years, and every one had suffered the same archival migration error at the same time. Dresk had pointed this out to Touche. The young archivist had looked at the screen, looked at Dresk, and then, with a deliberateness that suggested the action was not spontaneous, opened a drawer in his desk and slid a physical document across the surface. It was a printout, not a screen copy, but a physical printout, old enough that the thermal paper had yellowed. It was a file index. The index listed 137 documents under a heading that read, Exclusion Boundary Incident Reports Unreleased. No classification stamp. No restriction notice. Just a list of documents that existed somewhere in the archive's physical storage and had never been entered into the searchable database. I do not know where the physical copies are stored, Touche said. He paused. I was told there was a sublevel in the eastern wing that was decommissioned during a renovation 14 years ago. The renovation records indicate that the sublevel was emptied and sealed, but the power consumption data for that wing has never changed. The sublevel still draws power. I am not supposed to have noticed this. 2 days later, Touche was transferred. Dresk learned this when he returned to the archive and found a different archivist at the desk, an older Heliomer who processed Dresk's requests with the careful, measured efficiency of someone who had been specifically briefed. When Dresk asked about the sublevel in the eastern wing, the archivist said, "That sublevel does not exist, historian. The renovation records are quite clear." The file index, however, was already in Dresk's case, physical paper, untraceable. His second stop had been the Compact Council's own records office on Nexus Station, the political center of the 312 Species Alliance. Here the pattern repeated, but with a different texture. The council records were not hollowed out, they were layered. The official record of the exclusions establishment was a diplomatic document, beautifully crafted, describing a mutual agreement between the Compact and the Human Territorial Authority to establish a sovereign boundary. It read like a treaty. It had the structure of a treaty, but it lacked one element that every other treaty in the Council's archive possessed, a countersignature. The human side of the document was blank. The treaty that established the most significant territorial boundary in galactic history had been signed by 312 species, and none of the humans it supposedly bound. The junior archivist at the Council Records Office, a Kethani named Vosk, quiet and precise, had noticed this too. He had not said so directly. He had simply placed the document on the reading table with the blank countersignature facing Dresk, and then he had left the room for 11 minutes. When he returned, he set down a cup of tea he had not been asked for and said, "I have recently been reviewing pre-compact diplomatic protocols, the oldest ones. There are references to a practice called response through absence. When a sufficient power received a lesser power's diplomatic communication and chose not to engage, it returned the document unmarked. The absence of the signature was the response. It meant, your terms are noted, we do not negotiate." Vosk had picked up his tea and left again. Dresk had sat with the blank countersignature for a long time. He ran his finger across the empty space where the human representative's name should have been a smooth, unblemished surface, as if the paper itself had refused to accept ink. The emptiness was data. The silence was testimony. He spent 2 more days at Nexus Station. The Council's archive contained 4,612 treaties spanning the Compact's entire history. Everyone was countersigned. Everyone bore the marks of negotiation amendments, addenda, minority opinions. The exclusion document had none of this. No amendments, no correspondence, no negotiation record. It had been drafted by the Compact's diplomatic bureau, transmitted to the exclusion, and filed with a blank countersignature. The document did not even have a transmission receipt. It existed as a statement made by the Compact to itself, about a boundary that the other party had never acknowledged, objected to, or discussed. It was not a treaty. It was a prayer, a request made to something that was under no obligation to listen, and that had responded with the most eloquent answer available: silence. Dresk did not prefer the comfort of the gap. He had never preferred it. That was the flaw in his character that had made him a good historian, and a difficult colleague, the inability to leave a gap unfilled, the refusal to accept that some questions were better left unasked. The gap demanded a follower, and he had followed it across 100 days and half a galaxy, and into the archives of institutions that existed to prevent exactly the kind of discovery he was pursuing. At the Druvan Military Academy's historical archives, his third stop, 58 days into the voyage, Dresk found the incident reports. Not the ones listed on Tush's index, but a different set, maintained by the Druvan's own Border Patrol Command. The Druvan were methodical record keepers, a cultural trait that made their archives the most reliable in the compact, and also the most difficult to hollow out. Someone had tried. The incident reports had been reclassified, moved from the active archive to a sub-archive designated administrative overflow, a filing category that Dresk recognized as meaningless, a bureaucratic oubliette where documents were sent to be forgotten. But the Druvan had physical backups. They always had physical backups. It was a point of species pride. And the physical backups were stored in a vault that the reclassification order had not reached, because the vault predated the reclassification system by 2 centuries and operated on its own protocol. The vault attendant was a retired Druvan warrant officer named Krishak, old enough that his exoskeletal plates had gone dull, and one of his compound eyes had clouded to opacity. He did not ask Dresk why he wanted access. He did not check credentials. He simply led Dresk down 3 levels of reinforced corridor to a room lined with physical document cases, each one sealed with the Druvan Military Academy's embossed insignia, and said, "The filing system is chronological. Do not remove originals. There is a reproduction station at the eastern wall. You may stay as long as you require." Then Krishak left, and Dresk understood that this, too, was deliberate. The vault attendant had been waiting for someone to come. The Druvan did not leave their vaults unattended as an oversight. They did it because a Druvan who believed that a record should be found ensured that it could be found. Dresk spent 3 days in the vault. He read 14 incident reports spanning 60 years. They were written in the flat, clinical prose of Druvan military documentation, and they were the most disturbing documents he had ever encountered. The incidents followed a pattern. A patrol vessel assigned to the exclusion boundary would deviate from its route. Sometimes intentionally, a navigator who plotted a course a few arcseconds too close, a commander who ordered one more sweep of a sector that the chart said was empty. Sometimes accidentally, a course correction error, a sensor ghost that drew a vessel off its track. The deviations were small. 11 light minutes, 3 light hours. Once, in a report dated standard year 1847, a full light day. In every case, the vessel returned. In every case, the vessel was undamaged. In every case, the crew was alive and physically intact. And in every case, something had changed. The crew of the first vessel, the 11 light minute deviation, had returned silent. 7 crew members, not one word spoken again. The crew of the 3 light hour deviation had returned speaking normally, but with a 12-hour gap in their logged flight time that none of them could account for, and a navigational computer whose memory had been wiped for that period, with a precision that the Druvan's own technical analysts described as impossible without physical access to the hardware. The crew of the full light day deviation had returned speaking normally, remembering their entire journey, and carrying a single object that had not been aboard when they departed. A small, smooth, featureless sphere of a material that Druvan metallurgists could not identify, resting on the navigator's console as if it had always been there. The sphere was warm to the touch. It hummed at a frequency just below the threshold of Druvan hearing. And when the commanding officer attempted to remove it from the vessel for analysis, it vanished. Not disintegrated, not transported. It was in his hand and then it was not. The incident report noted, in the characteristically dry Druvan fashion, that this constituted a material anomaly of unresolvable provenance. It recommended no further investigation. The recommendation was accepted. There were subtler incidents documented deeper in the vault. A patrol vessel that returned with its external hull covered in a thin film of organic material that evaporated within 6 hours of docking. The film had been warm. It had smelled, according to the crew's medical officer, like rain on vegetation, a sensory reference the Druvan did not possess, which meant the medical officer had looked it up later and recognized what he had smelled only after researching pre-withdrawal records of the human homeworld. A communications relay positioned at the boundary had, over 3 months, developed the ability to receive transmissions on frequencies. It was not designed to access 47 distinct signals in a language no species in the compact recognized. The linguistic analysis section was blank except for a single handwritten note. The grammar is not consistent with any known species. It may not be language as we understand the term. And there was one more report, the last one chronologically, dated just 9 years before Dresk's visit. A Druvan scout vessel had been conducting a routine patrol along a sector of the boundary that was considered inactive. No incidents had been reported in that sector for over 3 decades. The vessel's commander, an experienced officer with 20 years of boundary service, had noticed something in his optical display that did not register on any of his electronic sensors. A light, faint, steady, positioned just beyond the boundary line. Not a star, its spectral profile did not match any stellar classification. Not a beacon, it pulsed on no discernible frequency. Just a light, hanging in the void at a precise distance from the boundary, close enough to be seen, far enough to be unreachable without crossing. The commander had watched the light for 6 hours. In his report written by hand, Dresk noted, not dictated to the standard recording system, he described the light as having a quality he struggled to articulate. It was not inviting. It was not threatening. It was acknowledging, as if something on the other side of the boundary knew the commander was there, knew he was watching, and had placed the light precisely where it could be seen as a gesture, not a message, not a warning, but a recognition. A nod between sentries who serve different posts but understand the same duty. The commander had completed his patrol and returned to base. His report was filed in the Administrative Overflow subarchive. No one responded to it. No one acknowledged it. It existed in the vault because the Druvan did not discard records, and because Krishak knew where the vault was, and because Dresk had followed the gap. Dresk read the reports twice. He made notes on physical paper in ink, a habit he had developed over the course of the voyage. Digital notes could be accessed, altered, deleted. Paper existed in the world. It had weight. From the Druvan archives, Dresk continued along the boundary. He stopped at 4 more stations over the next 39 days. At a Kethani trade outpost that had once served as a diplomatic way station for exclusion-adjacent commerce, a retired merchant captain named Ravan shared an account over a meal of reconstituted grain. His cargo vessel had drifted into the exclusion during an engine malfunction 11 years prior. The vessel was towed back by its own crew after 3 days. Nothing was taken, nothing was damaged. But the cargo, 800 metric tons of processed mineral ore, sealed in standardized shipping containers, had been reorganized. Every container, every crate, every sealed unit had been opened, its contents examined, and repacked with a precision that exceeded the original loading specifications. The ore was no longer arranged by weight or type, as the manifest specified. It was arranged by atomic number. 800 metric tons of raw material sorted at the molecular level and then put back. The seals were intact, Ravan said. He had the hollow look of someone who had spent 11 years not being believed. Every magnetic lock, every tamper indicator, all intact, but the contents had been rearranged. My loading master verified this. He ran a full audit. It took him 9 days, every container sorted to atomic precision and not a single seal broken. What did you report? Rivon laughed. It was not a happy sound. I reported a cargo discrepancy. The filing system does not have a category for the contents of my cargo hold were reorganized by an unknown agency operating at the molecular level while inside the exclusion. The discrepancy was noted. The cargo was accepted. No one asked a follow-up question. No one wanted to. At a decommissioned heliomar sensor array that still maintained a skeleton crew, a senior technician named Groth unlocked a compartment beneath the primary processing unit and showed Dresk 22 years of continuous boundary observation stored on crystalline data cores. Row upon row of cores, each dated, each full. 22 years of recorded data that no one outside the station had ever accessed. What do they show? Dresk asked. Groth looked at the cores with something close to reverence. Officially, nothing. Nominal background radiation. No anomalous signals, no vessel traffic. The boundary is quiet. But the background radiation profile changes. Once every 47 days precisely the profile shifts. Not by much, a fraction of a fraction, but it shifts in a way that is not random. It is structured, patterned. Something on the other side is emitting a signal so deeply embedded in the background noise that it can only be detected by comparing readings 47 days apart. The signal has been there for 22 years. It repeats on the same cycle, and I cannot decode it. Have you tried? I have tried everything in my technical repertoire. I have applied every decryption method, every signal analysis algorithm, every linguistic pattern matching tool available to a compact-trained sensor technician. The signal does not respond to any of them. It is not encrypted. It is not compressed. It is simply in a form that our analytical tools are not designed to process, like trying to read a painting by running it through a text translator. Have you reported this? Groth looked at Dresk with an expression that combined patience with exhaustion. To whom, historian? The array is decommissioned. It does not exist. The data it records does not exist. And I am a technician assigned to a facility that, according to the Compact's registry, was dismantled 18 years ago. He closed the compartment and locked it. I record the data because that is my function. I do not report it because there is no one who wants to receive it. But I will tell you this. I sometimes think it is a heartbeat. Something alive, breathing on a 47-day cycle, pulsing at the edge of detection. At a Compact Science Bureau facility that had been quietly defunded 18 years ago, the sole remaining researcher, a Toravon biophysicist named Kedra, shared a finding she had never published. She had been studying the electromagnetic profile of the boundary itself, not the space beyond it but the line, the precise coordinates where the Compact's chart said sovereignty changed hands. The line had a signature. Not a wall, not a barrier, not a detectable force field, but a measurable change in the quantum state of particles that crossed it. Particles on the Compact side behaved normally. Particles that crossed the line and returned exhibited a subtle alteration in their spin characteristics. Consistent, reproducible, and inexplicable. The particles had been tagged, marked, by something operating at a level of physical manipulation the Compact had no framework for. The line is not a political boundary, Kedra told Dresk. It is a physical one. Something is maintaining it at the subatomic level, continuously, across a perimeter spanning hundreds of light years. The energy required is beyond anything our civilization has conceptualized. And it has been running for over a century without interruption. The Navigation Guild had given him the final detail. Chief Cartographer Esuth had been charting the boundary for 31 years. She showed him overlays the boundary had shifted inward by 0.037 arcseconds. The humans are pulling back, Esuth said, giving us more room, as if they are trying to occupy the smallest possible volume. Why would something that powerful want to be small? He arrived at Marker Station Adrune on the 97th day. The station occupied a position precisely on the exclusion boundary, oriented so that its operational sections and habitation decks faced inward, toward the compact. Every viewport, every observation port, every external sensor array pointed away from the exclusion. The station had been built to watch nothing. Station Commander Kithari met him at the docking bay. She was driven tall, her exoskeletal plates polished to the deep bronze of a career officer. Her mandibles tightened when he explained his purpose. "The Bureau of Cultural Sciences," she said, examining his transit credentials. "To the compact's administrative apparatus, this station does not exist. We receive supplies on a logistics route filed as a maintenance shuttle for an unmanned relay satellite. Our personnel rotations are processed through a subdivision with no public-facing registry." She handed back his credentials. "And yet here you are." She gave him access to the personnel and scheduling records that fell under his bureau authorization. Dresk spent 2 days reviewing the rotation schedules and found a pattern unlike anything at any other compact facility. No crew member had served a second tour. In 40 years of continuous operation, nearly 80 complete rotations, not a single individual had returned. The rotation schedule read like a one-way list: names arriving, names departing, never the same name twice. Most departing crew had been reassigned to postings far from the boundary. Several had retired early. A few had simply disappeared from the personnel system entirely, not terminated, not deceased, just absent from the records. "No one comes back," Kithari confirmed. They were in the station's small observation room, where the viewports had been replaced with display screens showing sensor feeds, all oriented inward. "That is not policy. The crew members choose not to return. The most common answer is that the station is quiet, and the quiet is the wrong kind." "The wrong kind," Dresk repeated. "Silence on a remote posting is normal. The crew adjusts. It becomes background, but the silence here does not become background. It remains present, active. The crew members describe it as being listened to. Not monitored. We sweep for surveillance regularly and there is nothing. Listened to, as if the silence itself is paying attention." She told him about her own experience. Twice, in the 18 months of her current rotation, she had felt it. Not watched, that was too simple, too adversarial. Observed, dispassionate, complete. As if something had turned its attention to the station the way a cartographer turns attention to a detail on a map, noting its position, registering its existence, cataloging its properties, and moving on. Both times, the sensation had lasted approximately 10 minutes and then faded, leaving behind a residual awareness that persisted for hours, the knowledge that the station was known. "Something patient," she said. "Something that has been waiting so long that the waiting has become its nature. The way a mountain waits, not for anything in particular, just waiting because that is what mountains do." On his 3rd day at Adrun, Dresk found Orun Kedai. She was in the lower maintenance level, in a compartment converted into living quarters that appeared on no schematic. The door was unlocked. Orun Kedai sat at a desk covered in physical documents, actual paper, a medium so archaic that Dresk had only handled it in museum settings. She was old. Her scales had gone from the deep green of a young Toravan to the pale amber of advanced age, and her eyes had the clouded look that came with decades of insufficient medical attention. She looked up when Dresk entered, and she smiled. "I wondered when they would send another one," she said. Dresk sat down across from her. The compartment was small and warm and smelled of old paper and something faintly metallic. "No one sent me," he said. "I found your name in a transfer log at the Druvan Military Academy. I followed the gap." "That is how it works," Orun said. "The gap is the invitation. They do not hide the gaps. They leave them precisely the right shape and precisely the right size. A mind like yours or mine 40 years ago cannot resist a gap. We are scholars. We fill gaps. That is our function. That is what they know about us." "They," Dresk said. Orun looked at him with the patience of someone who had waited 4 decades for a conversation. I crossed the boundary, historian Vahel, not by 11 light minutes. I went in. My vessel was cleared for a cultural survey which gave me authorization to approach the boundary and conduct passive observations. I went further. I had to. The gap was too perfectly shaped. Every piece of missing information pointed inward, like a current. She reached across the desk and turned one of the paper documents toward him. It was a hand-drawn chart, an actual physical map, rendered in ink, the kind of artifact that belonged in a pre-spaceflight museum. The chart showed the near edge of the exclusion, but where the compact's charts showed empty space, Orun's showed structure, stations, markers, routes. And at the center, deeper than any compact vessel had ever traveled, a single notation in her precise script, "Still here." "What is still here?" Dresk asked. "Everything," Orun said. "That is the horror, historian. I expected ruins, the detritus of a collapsed species. Every model our civilization has built assumes decline. Humans were short-lived, violent, unstable. The consensus is that they retreated because they were dying, that the exclusion is a hospice curtain. That is what I believed when I went in." She leaned forward. The metallic smell grew stronger. "They are not dying, Dresk. They are not collapsed. They are not feral. They are still here, and they are more than they were. Much more. I traveled for 19 days into the exclusion. The first 3 were ordinary empty space, no signals, just the dark and the silence. On the 4th day I passed a marker buoy. Featureless, matte black, the size of a grain silo, hanging without visible means of station keeping. It broadcast no signal my instruments could detect, but when I passed, the buoy rotated, a quarter turn. The section that became visible was smooth and reflective, and in it I saw my vessel reflected back from the wrong angle, from above, as if something was looking down. On the 7th day, I passed a structure I catalogued as an asteroid, 4 kilometers across, tumbling slowly on its axis. As I passed within 200 kilometers, it stopped tumbling. A section of its surface opened not like a hatch but like an eye, a circular aperture 2 kilometers wide that irised open and revealed an illuminated interior my optical sensors could not resolve. It oriented itself toward my vessel and looked, for 3 minutes. Then it closed, and the asteroid resumed its tumble. On the 10th day, I detected something my navigational computer attempted to classify as a vessel. 900 meters in length, but its mass readings were inconsistent. The computer kept revising its estimate, as if the object's mass was changing in real time. It moved parallel to my course for 4 hours, matching my velocity, and then stopped appearing on my sensors. But through the optical viewport I could still see it, a dark shape against the stars, watching. On the 12th day, the stars were wrong, not missing, rearranged. Their spectral signatures did not match any catalog. Someone had moved them, placed them in a deliberate pattern governed by a mathematics I could not access. On the 15th day, I entered a graveyard of communications. My receiver began picking up fragments, thousands of them. Every diplomatic, military, and scientific signal the compact had ever transmitted toward the exclusion over the past century, stored somehow in the fabric of space itself, replaying on a loop so faint that only the most sensitive equipment could detect them. Every unanswered message, preserved, as if to say, we heard all of it. On the 19th day, I reached a place my navigational computer described as a gravitational anomaly. It was a city, not a station, not a habitat. A city built in open space with no visible hull, no containment, no atmospheric barrier. An open structure larger than anything the compact has ever built, and it was populated. I could see movement, human figures, walking in open space as if it were ground. Orun stopped. Her eyes drifted to the viewport, the one viewport in the compartment, and Dresk realized with a lurch that this one faced outward, toward the boundary, toward the exclusion. "I did not land," Orun said. "I did not attempt contact. I watched for 3 hours. In those 3 hours, I saw things that I have spent 40 years trying to describe in language that a Toravan mind can process, and I have failed at every attempt. I saw structures that reconfigured themselves while I watched, not mechanical reconfiguration, not the movement of parts, but a continuous reshaping, as if the structures were made of something that was simultaneously solid and fluid, maintaining form by choice rather than by material constraint. I saw vessels that did not move through space in any way our physics can describe. The space around them simply changed, and they were in a different place, as if travel itself was an obsolete concept they had moved past. I saw children, or what I took to be children, smaller figures, moving among the larger ones in the patterns that every species uses to denote the young, clustering, darting, returning to the larger figures for reassurance. They were raising children in open space, in a city with no walls. And I saw a star, a main sequence star, a living sun, burning at approximately 4 light minutes from the city's outer edge. And I watched a human hand, an ordinary hand, 5 fingers, the same basic morphology documented in every pre-withdrawal biological survey, reach up and adjust the star's luminosity the way you or I would dim a lamp. A casual gesture, an afterthought, as if the output of a main sequence star was a matter of personal comfort, adjusted when the light was too bright for the children. Dresk sat very still. The recorder hummed. He was aware, distantly, that his secondary heart had begun to beat faster, the Toravan stress response that preceded either flight or deep concentration. He chose concentration. And then something spoke to me, not through my communication system, not through any channel my instruments could detect, inside my vessel, inside my mind. A voice, calm, unhurried, neither male nor female, speaking in a language I did not recognize but understood perfectly. 3 sentences. You have come far enough. We have let you see what you needed to see. Go back and remember. No threat, no hostility, no command. And I understood that they had been aware of me from the first second I crossed the boundary. That the buoy, the eye, the shadow vessel, the rearranged stars, the graveyard, all of it was deliberate. A guided tour. They showed me exactly what they wanted me to see in the order they chose, not to frighten me, to inform me. Which is? Orun Ketai looked at him directly. That the exclusion is not a border, it is a courtesy. The humans drew it not because they needed to keep us out, but because they chose to keep themselves in. They could cross it at any moment, and there is nothing the compact could do. The blank space on the chart is not ignorance. It is policy. Then why do they stay inside? Dresk asked. Orun turned to the viewport. The stars outside were sparse, and beyond the boundary the star density dropped sharply, as if someone had rearranged it. There are references in the pre-compact text's fragments, half-erased, inscribed on materials that predate every known writing system, to a period the old scholars called the vacancy, a time when something moved through this region of the galaxy and left it empty. Not destroyed, there were no ruins, no debris fields, no scorched worlds. Empty. Clean, every system surveyed, every world catalogued, every trace of prior occupation removed with a precision that the pre-compact scholars described as surgical. As if someone had swept a floor. The biomes were left intact. The atmospheres were untouched. The geological structures were undisturbed. Only the civilizations were gone. Only the evidence of habitation, of technology, of intelligence. Removed with the care of someone who valued the worlds but had no interest in their inhabitants. The vacancy ended as suddenly as it began. The species that survived, the ones that had been too remote, too primitive, too far from the main routes to attract attention, rebuilt in its wake. They found worlds ready for habitation. They found ecosystems in perfect balance. They found, in several cases, infrastructure that appeared to have been built for them, landing platforms sized for their vessels, atmospheric compositions adjusted to their biological needs, orbital mechanics stabilized for their convenience. as if whatever had cleared the galaxy had also prepared it for what came next. That is the galaxy we inherited, not a wilderness reclaimed, a garden, planted, tended, and abandoned by a gardener whose purpose we do not understand. She turned back to Dresk. The humans found the same fragments. They found them early within the first century of their spacefaring history, according to the pre-withdrawal records, and they did something that no other species did. They believed the fragments. They did not dismiss the vacancy as myth or allegory or pre-scientific confusion. They read the fragments and they accepted what the fragments said, and they began to prepare. Their entire post-contact history, every war, every schism, every technological leap, every social upheaval was preparation. Not for expansion, not for conquest, for defense. Against something that had cleared the galaxy at least 3 times before, and that operated on a cycle measured in tens of thousands of years. When they were ready, they drew the line, stepped behind it, and began to wait. Wait for whatever caused the vacancy to return. They are not hiding, they are standing watch. The exclusion is not a quarantine, it is a garrison perimeter. And we are the civilians they have decided not to frighten. The compartment was quiet. The station hummed with the low mechanical pulse of a facility designed to observe nothing. Orun opened a drawer and removed a stack of paper, hundreds of pages, closely written in her precise academic script, with hand-drawn charts and diagrams folded between the text. 41 years of observation, annotation, and thought, recorded on a medium so primitive that the Compact's information control apparatus could not touch it. "I keep no digital records," she said. "There is no file to seal, no database to restrict, no network entry to delete. Only paper, only ink, only the physical document handed from one scholar to another." Dresk took the stack. The paper was heavy. The metallic smell was the ink, a custom formulation Orun had devised from maintenance supplies. "You understand," Orun said, "that the moment you carry those documents off this station, you become a gap in someone else's record. The Bureau will notice. Your file will acquire a notation. Your transit permits will become difficult. Your university will receive a quiet suggestion that your focus might be redirected. You will not be arrested or harmed. You will simply become harder to find, harder to cite, harder to remember. The gap will grow around you the way it grew around me." "I understand," Dresk said. "And you understand that what is in those documents will change the way you think about every dark viewport, every blank chart, every quiet sector. You will look at the empty spaces on the map and know they are not empty. You will understand that the silence of the exclusion is not abandonment. It is the silence of a sentry who has been standing post for a century and has not yet been relieved." Dresk held the documents against his chest. Through the viewport, the boundary stars burned cold and sparse, and beyond them the exclusion stretched dark and still and immense, and somewhere in that darkness a hand adjusted the brightness of a star. He left Adrun the following morning. Kithari watched him board the shuttle without comment. She did not ask what he had found in the lower maintenance level. She did not ask about the sealed case he carried. She watched him go with the expression of someone who had seen this before, and would see it again, the scholar who came to fill the gap, and who left carrying the gap inside them. Dresk's return voyage took 83 days. He traveled the same route he had taken outbound, stopping at the same stations, passing through the same transit corridors. But the journey felt different. The stations seemed smaller. The corridors seemed quieter. The viewports, he could not stop looking at the viewports. Everyone he passed, he turned toward the direction of the exclusion, even when it was not visible, even when there was nothing to see but the ordinary traffic of ordinary compact space. He was looking for the shape of what Orun had described, the absence that was not absence, the empty space that was full. At the Heliomar Naval Archives, Tush's replacement confirmed that the previous archivist had been transferred. Location unrecorded. The replacement processed Dresk's departure filing with the same careful, brief efficiency. She did not look up when he left. At the Compact Council's records office, Vosk was still there. The Kethani archivist nodded to Dresk as he passed through the corridor but did not speak. He did not need to. The blank counter-signature had already said everything there was to say. At the Kethani trade outpost, the merchant captain Rivan was gone. Early retirement, the outpost manager explained, though the paperwork had been processed with unusual speed. His quarters had already been reassigned. The gap was closing around him, quietly and without malice, the way it closed around everyone who spoke. At the decommissioned sensor array, Groth was still there, still recording data that went nowhere, still measuring the 47-day signal cycle. He nodded to Dresk and said, "The signal is still there. It has been there since before I arrived, and it will be there after I leave. I have begun to think of it as a pulse, something alive, something breathing in the dark for longer than any of us have been keeping records." At the Compact Science Bureau facility, Kedra was gone. The facility was locked. Through the viewport, Dresk could see her equipment still powered, still running, still measuring the quantum signature of a boundary maintained at the subatomic level by something beyond comprehension. Dresk stood outside the locked facility for a long time, his breath fogging the viewport. Through the glass, Kedra's instruments hummed in their empty room, status indicators blinking green operational, nominal, collecting data that no one would read. The data accumulated in local storage, overwriting the oldest readings as the memory filled, a cycle of recording and erasure that would continue until the power finally failed. He wondered whether the quantum signature was intensifying the way the boundary contraction was accelerating, and whether Kedra, wherever she had gone, was still thinking about the line she had measured. He thought about her finding the line drawn not on a chart but in the fabric of reality, an ongoing act of will maintained in real time spanning hundreds of light years. He thought about the species that was expending that energy, and about the fact that maintaining a subatomic boundary across a sector of the galaxy was apparently a task they could perform continuously for a century as a background process. Not their primary function, not their main effort, a perimeter, a housekeeping task. The equivalent of leaving a light on so the neighbors knew someone was home. At the Navigation Guild, Esuth was still there, still measuring. She showed Dresk a new overlay. The boundary had shifted again. Inward, by another fraction of a fraction. The humans pulling themselves smaller, tighter, more concentrated, like a fist closing around something it refused to drop. "It is accelerating," Esuth said quietly. "Not by much. But over the last 3 years, the rate of contraction has increased by a factor of 0.004. They are pulling in faster." "Why?" Esuth looked at her charts. "I do not know, historian, but I have been measuring long enough to know that when something changes its behavior after decades of consistency, there is a reason, something they have detected, something they are responding to." She folded the overlay and placed it back in the drawer. "I hope I am wrong." Dresk looked at the drawer where Esuth kept her overlays. He thought about Orun City, the open structures, the children in the void, the casual hand adjusting a star. A species that had transcended every physical limitation its biology had imposed, and that was nonetheless contracting its perimeter. Not because it was weakening, because it was focusing. "You are not wrong," Dresk said quietly. Esuth did not respond. She did not need to. Her charts had already said it. The last 40 days of Dresk's return voyage were the longest of his life. He spent them in the narrow quarters of his chartered shuttle, surrounded by the physical documents he had accumulated. Tush's yellowed file index, his hand-drawn copy of the blank countersignature, his notes from the Druvan vault, the transcribed testimonies of merchant captains and sensor technicians and biophysicists, and Orun Kedai's stack of handwritten pages, heavy with custom ink. The shuttle's viewport showed the ordinary traffic of ordinary compact space cargo haulers, transit beacons, the navigational buoys that marked the well-traveled routes between core worlds. All of it seemed thinner now, provisional, as if the infrastructure of civilization was a set built on a stage, convincing only if you did not look at the edges. He read Orun's documents during the transit, all of them, hundreds of pages of meticulous observation, annotated with cross-references to pre-compact texts that Dresk recognized from his own research, and dozens more that he had never encountered. Orun had spent 41 years not merely recording what she had seen, but building a theoretical framework for what it meant. The framework was organized into sections that reflected the evolution of her thinking, early entries characterized by disbelief, middle entries by a systematic attempt to reconcile her observations with known physics, and late entries by an acceptance that known physics was insufficient. Her marginal notes tracked her own psychological state with clinical honesty. Day 4212. I have stopped attempting to translate the navigational data into compact standard notation. The error is not in the notation. The error is in the assumption that position and distance mean the same thing on both sides of the line. Her framework was incomplete. She acknowledged this repeatedly, with the self-critical discipline of a scholar who knew the limits of her data. But the framework's central proposition was clear. The exclusion was not a political artifact. It was not a territorial claim. It was not even, in any meaningful sense, a decision. It was a posture, the stance of a species that had positioned itself between the galaxy and something it expected to arrive. The humans had not withdrawn from galactic affairs because they had lost interest. They had withdrawn because they had discovered something that required their full attention, and they had concluded that the galaxy could not help. The line was not drawn for the galaxy's protection. It was drawn so the galaxy would not get in the way. Orun's documents included a section 47 pages, the most densely annotated in the entire collection on the vacancy. She had cross-referenced the pre-compact fragments with geological surveys, stellar age data, and the archaeological record of 6 species that had survived the event. The vacancy had not been a single episode. It had been a cycle. The fragments suggested at least 3 previous occurrences, each separated by roughly 40 to 60,000 years. The most recent had been 51,000 years ago. The pre-compact scholars who had identified the pattern had been unable to determine whether the cycle was ongoing or concluded. Orun's annotation in her careful script read, "If the cycle is ongoing, we are overdue. The humans appear to have reached the same conclusion." Dresk closed Orun's documents and sat in the dark of his shuttle for a long time. Through the viewport, the core worlds blazed with the light of 312 civilizations going about their business building, trading, arguing, living their lives in the comfortable assumption that the galaxy was theirs. They did not know about the cycle. They did not know about the vacancy. They did not know that the blank space on their charts was not empty but occupied, and that what occupied it was standing guard against something that had scoured the galaxy clean at least 3 times before. He thought about Esuth's measurement, the boundary contracting faster, the humans pulling in, and he understood with the cold, still clarity of a scholar who has finally assembled the last piece of a puzzle he wishes he had never begun, what that acceleration might mean. They were not just pulling in, they were bracing. Dresk returned to Toravon Prime and requested a meeting with the Chancellor of Historical Sciences. The Chancellor was Sirth Vane, a colleague of 40 years, a Toravon who had supervised Dresk's earliest research, and who had, over the decades, quietly steered Dresk away from the exclusion topic more times than either of them had acknowledged. They met in the Chancellor's private study, a room with wide viewports facing the university's garden terraces. Dresk placed the sealed case on the desk between them. "I found Orun Kedai," he said. Sirth Vane looked at the case. His expression did not change. He did not ask who Orun Kedai was. He did not pretend not to recognize the name. "I know," he said. "You know she is alive. You know where she is." "I know what she found," Sirth Vane said. "Not from her. I have never met her, never read her report. I know because the chancellor before me knew, and the chancellor before that, and the one before that. It is passed from one to the next, not in writing, in conversation, in a room with no recording devices, with the viewports shuttered. The senior academic leadership of every major compact institution knows. The naval admirals know. The council members know. And no one speaks. No one speaks because there is nothing to say that would help. What will we tell the public, Dresk? That the line on the map is not ours. That the most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy exist at the sufferance of a species that stopped talking to us a century ago. Sirth Vane's voice was level, but his tail had coiled tight against his body, the Toravan posture of deep fear held under discipline. The compact functions because its member species believe they have agency. Remove that belief and you do not get enlightenment. You get panic. You get fleet mobilizations that accomplish nothing against an adversary that maintains a subatomic perimeter across hundreds of light years as a background task. The boundary is contracting faster, Dresk said. The words came out with the flat precision of data reported. The Navigation Guild has measured it. The rate of contraction has increased over the last 3 years. Sirth Vane's tail coiled tighter. For the first time in 40 years of acquaintance, Dresk saw something in the Chancellor's face that he had never seen before. Dread. The ancient, bone-deep dread of a species that had survived the vacancy by being too insignificant to attract attention. And that carried the survival instinct in its genetic memory, even if the conscious mind had forgotten the reason. How much faster? Sirth Vane asked. 0.004 over 3 years. It is small, but it is a change, and the cartographer who measured it has 31 years of baseline data. Sirth Vane was quiet for a long time. The garden outside caught the late afternoon light, the violet blooms turning deep indigo as the sun angle shifted. Then the archives matter more than ever, he said. Because if the rate is changing, then whatever is coming may be closer than we thought. And if it arrives, the galaxy will need the truth. Not because the truth can save us, but because a civilization that faces its end without understanding what defended it dies without meaning. And that is the one thing scholars can prevent, not death, but meaninglessness. He reached across the desk and placed his hand on the sealed case. I will take this. I will place it where it belongs in the deep archive with the other copies, with the testimony of the survey crews who came back silent. It will not be published. It will not be cited, but it will exist. And when the next scholar follows the gap, because there will always be a next scholar, Dresk, the gap demands it, they will find it. What do we do? Dresk asked. Sirth Vane turned to the viewport and looked at the garden, and beyond the garden at the sky, and beyond the sky at the place where the stars thinned. We do what the galaxy has always done, he said. We do not look. We do not ask. We do not cross. We maintain the fiction that the line is ours, and we hope with every faculty we possess that whatever the humans are guarding against never arrives. Because if it does, then the only thing standing between the galaxy and the vacancy is the species we have spent a century pretending does not exist. He turned back to Dresk. And if it does arrive, historian Vahel, then the archives will matter, because someone will need to know that we knew, that we were not ignorant. That we saw the sentries standing at the edge of the dark, and we understood, even if we could not say it aloud, that they were standing there for us. Dresk left the Chancellor's study in the late afternoon, when the garden light was turning amber, and the first of the evening winds moved through the terraces. He walked through the university's central hall, past the great mosaic map of known space that had been the institution's centerpiece for 3 centuries. The map was beautiful, hundreds of thousands of hand-placed tiles representing every cataloged system, every trade route, every diplomatic boundary. And at the edge of the Orion arm where the tiles should have continued, they stopped. Not broken, not damaged, simply absent. A region of bare wall where no tiles had ever been placed, as if the map's original designers had known, even 3 centuries ago, that there was a place where cartography ended and something else began. He stopped in front of the bare wall. A group of students passed behind him, young Toravan, their scales bright with youth, their voices quick and careless in the way that youth was always careless. They did not glance at the bare wall. They walked past the gap in the map the way every citizen of the compact walked past the gap in their knowledge, easily, comfortably, without awareness that there was anything to see. Dresk envied them. He would never walk past a gap that way again. He thought about Orun Ketai sitting in her hidden compartment with her paper and her hand-drawn charts, keeping watch over knowledge that no one was permitted to know. He thought about the 7 silent crew members in their care facility on Druvan Prime, alive and intact and wordless for 38 years. He thought about Tush, transferred to a posting he would never identify, carrying the memory of a file index he should never have found. He thought about Vosk with his tea, leaving room so that documents could be seen. He thought about Krishak unlocking a vault for a stranger because the record demanded a reader. He thought about Rivan, retired early with his story of molecularly sorted cargo, a gap growing around him in the shape of silence. He thought about Groth recording a 47-day heartbeat that no one wanted to hear. He thought about Kedra, gone now, her equipment still measuring the quantum signature of a line drawn in the fabric of reality. He thought about Esuth, folding her overlay into a drawer, hoping she was wrong about the acceleration. He thought about the hand adjusting the star. Dresk Vahel returned to his office. He sat at his desk for a long time without turning on his terminal. Through the window, the campus moved through its evening routine, all of it proceeding as if the blank space on the mosaic map downstairs was empty. He turned on his terminal. He opened a new file in the university's academic database and titled it Preliminary Survey of Administrative Designations in the Orion Exclusion Boundary Region, a Bureaucratic History. The driest, most administratively invisible title he could construct, the perfect camouflage for something that could not be said aloud. And then, buried in the footnotes in the deep apparatus that no casual reader would ever reach, that only another scholar following another gap would ever find, he began to write what Orun Ketai had told him. Not the full account, not the hand that adjusted the star, not the city in open space, just the edges, just the shape of the gap. Footnote 347, a reference to unresolved discrepancies in the boundary's reported position that hinted at Esuth's measurements. Footnote 412, a mention of anomalous sensor readings at decommissioned monitoring facilities that pointed toward Groth's 47-day pulse. Footnote 519, an observation about the absence of countersignature documentation in the founding treaty that a careful reader would recognize as the unsigned treaty. Each footnote was a thread. Each thread led inward, and at the end of each thread, if the reader followed it far enough, was the shape of a question that could not be answered without going to the boundary. He was building a gap, deliberately, precisely. He was not publishing the truth, he was publishing the invitation. The gap that a future scholar would not be able to resist. He wrote for 7 hours. When he finished, he saved the file and closed his terminal. He turned off the light in his office. He walked to the viewport and looked out at the evening sky above Toravan Prime, at the dense brilliance of the compact's core worlds, at the shipping lanes and station lights, and the comfortable, knowable infrastructure of a civilization that believed itself to be sovereign. And at the edge of his vision, just where the star density dropped, just where the charts went blank, the exclusion sat dark and still and patient. Standing watch. Somewhere in the university below him, in the deep archive that no index referenced, Orun Ketai's documents waited beside the chancellor's notes and the silent testimony of crews who had crossed the boundary and come back without words. The knowledge existed. It persisted. It would outlast every attempt to make it disappear, because scholars made copies and gaps demanded followers, and the truth, no matter how deeply buried, was patient too. Dresk Vahel looked at the exclusion for a long time. Then he turned away. He walked home through the quiet streets of the university district, under a sky that was, for now, exactly as bright as someone had decided it should be. He did not look up again.